Well, thank you guys for joining us today. I'm Travis Talaric. I'm one of the managing brokers at Pebble Homes. And more importantly, I head up our property management group, which is fitting for what we were going to talk about today, which is helping real estate agents guide their clients and be a trusted advisor and helping them navigate whether to sell a home that they currently own or exploring the possibility of holding on to it as a rental. It's fairly common these days because of the drastic change in interest rate environment and the drastic step up in property values and rents over the last few years, where this is really aimed at helping talk to our clients who maybe aren't investors, but are instead looking at, hey, I owned a primary residence. And before I just jump to the typical conclusion of I'm buying a new house, should I sell this one? Should I give any merit? Should I weigh whether to hold on to this and rent it out? So it's a conversation I have been having with plenty of clients over the past few years. I would assume with a few of you guys joining this call that some of you have seen the same. In fact, I know most people have cameras off, but maybe by a sign of like emojis, or if you put a thumbs up or anything like that in the chat. If any of you guys heard this from a client recently where they want you to discuss with them what it would look like to maybe hold on to a home and rent it out versus selling it. Okay, so at least one person, two. Okay, we got a few. Good. So we're in the right place. Awesome. Well, with that, we could go through this slide deck. I think this is only going to take about 30 minutes today, which means we will have plenty of time for if you have questions. So feel free to stop me even mid-sentence. I'd be happy to talk to your questions directly. It's a small group here, so it's very easy to do that. Again, I'm Travis Talaric. I head up our property management here at Pebble Homes. We have about 40 properties we manage. On top of managing other people's homes, I have a few rentals myself. So over the years, this is something we have developed, and I would say through talking to a lot of clients specifically, it helps knowing not just what property management entails, but how to help our clients address this situation. Awesome. Well, we're talking about it today. Again, this is becoming more and more common with the current market conditions of increased property values, increased rent, and a lot of clients who own maybe a primary residence or a home at a very low interest rate, where they see the holding costs and they consider maybe this is something I want to explore. So we're going to start with, a basic analogy, and you guys can feel free to take yourselves off mute if you want to chime in. But let's say you just won the Colorado State lottery and you get this dilemma, which is very common in how you can get paid out on the lottery. You can choose between receiving a lump sum payment of $5 million today, or if you're okay with that being paid out in an annuity or in installments, you can get $9 million paid out over the course of 20 years. So that'd be every month you're getting $37,500 for a total of $9 million paid out over 20 years. I'm just curious from you guys, which way would you lean? Or maybe even better, there's no right answer here. How would you even go about thinking through how to evaluate this decision?
Wouldn't you kind of break it down and be like, okay, well, if I invested in CDs or this or that, what would be the difference? I mean, that's how I would kind of go.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. We call that in finance like an opportunity cost, right? Like if I actually had $5 million today and I reinvest that, can I get more than $9 million paid out over the course of the 20 years? If so, maybe it'd be more attractive to take the lump sum today. Any other ways? And it doesn't have to be purely financial, like any
look
other
at your tax obligations.
Yeah, you could look at your tax bracket, right? If you receive $5 million today, you're going to pay it's going to put you in a very high tax bracket, right? You're going to have to pay a lot of taxes on that, where maybe it's more favorable to say, you know what, I don't need all this money today. I don't know what to invest in or do with it. So maybe instead I want something fixed and this income paid over the course of the next few years. That's another great consideration. Anything else you guys would think about in evaluating that decision? The only other one I like to bring up is sometimes, we like to set limits for ourselves and for our clients when we're talking about, for instance, buying a home and their budget, because we want to make sure that monthly payment fits with their lifestyle. And likewise, it's helpful to think of it's a non-financial decision but more of a personal finance decision, I'd say. You get 5 million today. Can you trust yourself with that money? Are you, you hear so often athletes or people come into a large sum of money, even winning the lottery, who waste it, who squander it. And so would it be practical to say, well, what if I put myself on, a monthly allotment I'm getting? Would I be more pragmatic with that? Would I be less wasteful? And so these are all good ways to think through this problem that we could talk about a bit today, because this would directly correlate to maybe thinking about, hey, I have an asset today, a home I can sell. Should I try to look at getting a lump sum payment for that today? Or is it more practical to hold on to that home and use it as a long-term investment, collect money over time? So some of the concepts we talked about, time value of money, I think Nate brought that up. We're going to use phrases like discounting money back to today, because the value of $9 million over 20 million or over 20 years, we want to actually, put some kind of, we call it a discount rate, to say, well, what would that be worth today? And that is very finance heavy. And I know that's not a hat we have to wear to that degree all the time for our clients, but it's at least being familiar with that concept and understanding that, a dollar today is worth more than a dollar tomorrow. Likewise with the risk tolerance and, what would be okay investing that in. It's not a sure thing if you take the 5 million today and put it in some other market like equities, that it will actually turn out better for you. And so it's always helpful to think through the risk on both sides of the equation. All right. Yeah. How this applies to real estate, we're kind of talking about that, this immediate liquidity versus long-term investment. So some of the key variables we're going to focus on today, some of these are financial, some are otherwise, but this is helpful for our clients to think through and which camp it would put us in. So I'll talk about each one in brief now, and then we'll do a bit of a deep dive on each of these variables as we go through the presentation today. So the first is ability to hold on to a current home. Again, we're specifically talking to clients who are moving out of their current house. They're thinking about, do I want to hold on to this or do I want to sell it? They do not always have the ability to make that decision to hold it. So that's always the first talking point I like to better understand. Where are they going? Are they going to rent? Are they going to buy a home? If they're going to buy a home, how are they going to pay for the down payment? If they're going to hold now a mortgage on their current place and take out a mortgage on this future property they want to buy, will that work for financing? Can they hold that much debt? Potentially 2 mortgages at once, although it doesn't always have to be that way. So that is the best first questions to understand and requires us to get a better understanding of our client's current financial condition. The next would be their equity position in the home. Oftentimes, the more equity you have in your home, so if you own it outright, it may push you to say, purely from a financial decision, it might be better to sell that home today. If it's levered, which means if there's a lot of debt on it, sometimes that could be a lot better to rent it out. Why is this? I think very simply put, when people think of real estate as an investment, over time, real estate appreciates. I think we've seen on average 4 to 5% a year over the last 50 years. There are more attractive investments sometimes that could even be more liquid, like putting it in an index fund, or right now, putting in some risk-free like US bonds and treasuries. So why do you pick real estate? Well, that's often because you can get pretty cheap debt if you're buying a home. And if you then look at the return relative to, you only had to put 10% down to buy this home, so you don't own 100% of it, only 10% of it, but you recoup 100% of the increase in equity over time because your debt is fixed. Well, sometimes the more debt you have on a home, it might lead you to, I want to hold on to this a bit longer. Where if you own it outright or close to outright, it might influence you to maybe think about selling it today. So understanding that our client's equity in their current home they're evaluating. Likewise, the other side of that equation is, what are the holding costs and debt terms associated with that? Do they have very high property taxes, very high HOA costs that would erode away potential margin if they were to rent it out? And more specifically to debt, this is the quick litmus test when I'm talking to my clients. If they bought their home in secured financing in like early 2022 and before then, there's a very high likelihood they have a very low interest rate associated with that home. If it's a 30-year fixed interest rate, it might be a good idea to hang on to that and rent it out for longer. If they bought this home more recently, I've seen a lot of this as well. People have now just bought within the last 3 years, late 2022 to now. Well, then they might be looking at such high cost of debt that even if they were to rent it, this property might not be cash flowing. It might not be making money for them. So understanding when they bought it, what are their debt terms, as well as other holding costs, can help steer us to, is it a better idea to maybe sell today or to rent? We look at rental suitability, right? We focus a lot on the cost, but is this a desirable rental? Typically rentals, there's a somewhat similar, it's a good Venn diagram with resale, but there's not perfect overlap. So maybe more bedrooms in a house are better fitted for something to be a rental. Renters are less worried about being on a slightly busier street if it's a great neighborhood, where resale that wouldn't be as favorable. Is it durable? Is the home holding up well enough to, even when you rent it, there are some repairs and, minimum living condition. In Colorado, we call it the warrant of habitability for it to be a good rental. Or could you say, hey, this needs so much work, maybe we just need to sell it to an investor today. I don't have the cash to put into it. Thinking about the home's current rental suitability. And then likewise, the very real concept of who is going to actually operate this rental. You can hire someone like us at Blue Pebble Homes, but pay a price for us to facilitate this rental and kind of quarterback it for you. Or if you have the time and experience, maybe this is something you could take in-house, but it's helpful to understand or have our clients understand, what does that look like? Would they be able to manage it themselves? Would that cost of hiring another manager push them to a point where maybe it's just better to sell today? So those are the 5 main variables we'll talk about. Before I get too much further, any questions on those or, terms I just threw out that are confusing? Awesome. Let's keep going. All right. Yeah. So this is talking about their ability to hold on to the home. That very first question I like to understand. If they want to explore holding onto this house as a rental, the most important factors to look at is if they're now buying a new home, do they have the cash to go put a down deposit on the new home they're trying to buy without tapping into the current home's equity? And then on the other side of that, do they have the ability to finance potentially 2 homes at once? So what I'm talking about here is if you want to make your current home into a rental, but you don't want to move out of it, you don't want to rent it until you've bought your new home. When you are procuring that new home and using a mortgage to buy it, a lender is going to look at you having 2 mortgages at the same time because your current residence is not yet rented out. It's not yet an investment property. So if you guys have heard of, like DTI, debt to income ratios like that, you're going to have a whole lot more debt you have to account for with the same amount of income you already have. So on the lending side, there's some ways to get around this. You could potentially rent out your home before you move into the next one. And maybe if the renters haven't moved in yet, you're getting a signed lease, you're getting a security deposit up front. But a lot of renters don't want to sign a lease and put down money too far in advance of when they're going to move in. So it's really helpful to think through the timing of how quickly can we get out of this current home and into the next one if we need to satisfy our lender that this will be a rental property before we close on the purchase of a new home. So those are the 2 main ways you want to think about it. When we talk about liquidity and cash you have on hand as well, it's important to help your clients understand when they're moving out of their current home, there are going to be some costs associated, even if they want to rent it. I think a lot of clients jump to the conclusion that if they're going to sell the house, sure, there's money you need to put into cleaning it and fixing it up, and those costs they know they're going to encounter. But a lot of clients don't understand that you're going to incur a lot of those same costs if you want to make your home a rental, such as you're still going to need to do minimum repairs, sometimes paint the home, sometimes get at least deep cleaned, and so it will be habitable right away. So make sure they have not just enough cash to go purchase a new home or move out to wherever they will be going, but also get their current home in shape to rent it out. Oftentimes we're talking like, about at least $1,000, sometimes a bit more than that, to put into their current house in order to rent it out. even though it's going to stay as a rental. Questions on that, or anything you guys have encountered on just purely, can I afford to hold on to this home? Awesome. Lively bunch.
So
Yeah.
when we're looking at qualifying for second mortgage, so you had mentioned, we want to make sure that there's a signed lease, something to show the bank or the lender that we do certainly intend to have income from this property. In fact, here it is. Here's the proof. Does that suffice, or do you already have to have some sort of history of rental payments from that property to really make the lender happy?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like most questions, it depends. And it's a good conversation to have with the lender from the get-go. I know using our in-house lending and working with people like Jessica, we've been able to meet lender requirements where they were happy enough, even though the lease has not started yet, but purely having a signed lease. In a signed lease where if we don't have money in hand, sometimes they do a rental appraisal, which is similar to, the appraisal you'd get if you're selling or buying a home, but purely on saying, hey, is the rent that these tenants have now signed on to start renting the home at about market value? Because if it's, the lender will have a lot more confidence to know, hey, this is right about at market. So we feel much more comfortable that there will be sufficient income on this home to rent it. And so sometimes that works. Sometimes they do want at least that first payment made and evidence of the first payment made ahead of time. And if we get to that is harder. If you think about purely timeline, if you're trying to buy a home, you will be doing multiple things at the same time. You'll likely be under contract on your new house, but not 100% certain you're going to close, while you're also entertaining showings at your current home to try and get a tenant to minimize the amount of overlap from the time you move out and you've now closed on your new purchase to now having the new tenants move in. And the further you stretch that time apart, the more it's going to hurt your ability to rent it. The tenants don't want to, over a month out, put money down on a place they're going to rent yet, typically. Good question. Yeah, understanding equity. I think most of us understand, again, I guess this is talking about opportunity costs. I'll move to the next slide here with that, but why would it make more sense, again, for helping a client understand, should I potentially sell this home today or hold on to it and rent it out? So a lot of times we're talking to clients in this situation who are exploring this problem with their primary residence. Now, if their primary residence has gone up in value since they bought it, which a lot of times in real estate it has, and if we're talking about at least 2021 or earlier, there's a good chance it has, even if they haven't put a lot of work in to improve the home. What our clients could be looking at here is a capital gain or gain on what they bought the property at versus what they could sell it at today, which should be evaluated, the tax implications for if they want to rent it out. Do any of you guys know kind of the fine print of how you could qualify for a capital gains exemption in the US? How many years did you have to live in this home in order to potentially have your capital gains exempt?
2 out of the last 5.
That's exactly right. That's 2 out of the last 5. For an individual, you could be exempt on up to $250,000 of capital gains. For a married couple filing jointly, that could be up to $500,000 of an exemption. So this is a great talking point for clients where if they want to rent it, we want to understand this timeline. Because once you have rented this property for over 3 years, it is now impossible to say you have lived there for 2 of the last 5, and you can no longer claim this exemption. So if you have a significant amount of appreciation in your home, it is worth thinking through, what are we trying to do here? For some clients, this might just steer them to, I want to sell right away. To others, and I've seen this before, they say, well, let's rent it out for a year, maybe 2 years. But before we enter into a lease renewal for that 3rd year, maybe at that time we look at, can we reach back and still utilize this capital gains exemption? Because technically, if you've rented it for only 2 years, you've still lived there for 2 of the last 5. And so you could still utilize that exemption then. So having a significant capital gain doesn't immediately disqualify my clients typically from saying, I no longer want to rent it out, but at least has us embark down the conversation of, is it worth doing this, knowing that it might only be a 1 or 2 year deal before you then want to sell it so you can still take advantage of this capital gains exemption. Does that make sense for the tax implications?
Isn't
And
there,
then,
I had a client that ran into this problem, almost got into a lot of trouble with depreciation
yeah,
on top of capital gains, and he ended up having to keep the property entirely.
yeah. So once you start renting a property, we don't talk about this too much today, but there's going to be some tax benefit because in addition to what we have today with being able to typically look at deducting interest, especially if you have an itemized deduction, if you rent a property and it's now an investment property, you're able to deduct your interest expense if you still have a mortgage, as well as you can depreciate the asset. So this gets a bit complicated and it is helpful to involve a CPA, but you'll have basis in the home, usually around what you paid for it. And you'll break that out to what is the value of the land and what is the value of the home itself. That value of the home itself, the structures don't get in better condition over time. So our tax code allows you to depreciate it when it's now a rental property. You can, straight line depreciation. This is getting fairly technical, but roughly you're going to take a little under 4% of the value of the home and be able to claim that as a deduction every year and offset your income. That is great for your annual cash flows and taxes, but you are now lowering the basis in your home so that when you then calculate a future capital gain, you've now eroded that initial basis more and more, where that gain is going to get bigger and bigger. And so that is important to note if you are going to maybe do this hybrid approach of renting it for 2 years and then trying to sell it, that you have also increased your basis. Even if the sale value of the home hasn't changed over those 2 years, you are eroding your cost basis of what you bought it for. You are taking those deductions today while you rent it and not keeping that as intact. Does that make sense? That gets pretty hairy into the tax stuff, but it's helpful to think through for just really emphasizing there are tax implications for if you want to hold onto a home for a few years to start to rent it out.
Yeah, and it gets really convoluted, and I ended up having to talk with the client's CPA about it because it confused the hell out of me. But,
yes, right. That's not a hat we should be wearing. I think what we should be pointing out is the point of maybe just being vaguely familiar with. We'll want to make sure we're being aware of your capital gains exemption timeline and how that's going to come into play. You could still rent it for a few years if you'd like and still sell it and likely take advantage of that. But at the same time, you'll want to talk to a tax CPA for understanding, especially when you start depreciating the home, what that's going to look like for your tax impact if you sell today versus 2 years from now or 3 years from now. I do have a lot of clients who, they start testing out as well. They say, we're going to do it for 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, they say, you know what, this has been going pretty well. Understand I'm losing my capital gains exemption, but I'm going to hold on to this now long term. I'm making the decision where I'm going to be a real estate investor now. This will be a rental for the foreseeable future, years to come. And it's a good conversation to have with our clients to circle back with them, even if they decide to rent, 2 years after they started to rent it.
So, same subject, but slight tangent. This at this juncture, when you're talking with your client, at this point, this is when you would probably bring in maybe a 1031 conversation. Should they want to sell down the road and they have all of this depreciation, they have the capital gains, they have that. This is probably where you would likely start talking about 1031 down the road.
And
right?
To clarify, there is a difference between a capital gains exemption on your primary residence and a 1031 like-kind exchange. Both of these will prevent you from paying taxes on your gains at the point of sale, but they are very different in that the capital gains exemption is a forever exemption. You don't have to pay these taxes now or ever in the future if you qualify for it. You're permanently forgiven of those capital gains, which is why it's so valuable. 1031 exchange just says we're not going to pay those taxes today. We will reinvest the proceeds into a new investment property But what you've essentially done is just kicked the can down the road a bit further. So it's very important to clarify those where once you're at, like you said, Nate, that 2-year junction, and now it's like, do we want to sell today and still try to take advantage of the capital gains exemption? Or do we want to hold on to long-term, knowing we could still 1031 down the road, ensuring your clients know, and they're talking to their tax CPA who knows that we are now talking about a change between having taxes permanently forgiven versus just being able to kick the can further down the road at the point of sale. Does that make sense? I take your silence as a yes. That makes sense more or less.
Totally.
Cool. The other thing with clients who have a high equity balance in their current home, thinking about their current debt structure. So I'm going to challenge your view of thinking about debt, maybe challenge what Dave Ramsey says of debt here. But again, real estate can be a very valuable investment once you take into account with how it is leveraged with the debt you have in place on a home. So put another way, clients who have a very low interest rate and maybe long-term fixed debt, it's very common to have a lot of clients with 3% or below fixed rate over 30 years on their primary residence that they're now exploring, do I want to sell it or do I want to rent it out? The amount of debt relative to the home value is very important because I would say that debt is almost like an asset when you have a very, very low cost of borrowing debt. So the more of it you have relative to the market value of the home today, the more it might, predispose you or be a check mark in the column of maybe we hold on to this as a rental. But put another way, say they have 3% debt, but they race to pay it down. So the market value of a home is $1 million today, and they only have $200,000 of debt left. Well, that's great that the debt's only at 3%, but the debt is so low relative to their overall equity position in the home now that that asset isn't doing much work anymore. It's getting close to just owning it free and clear, where it's great to know, hey, you're only paying 3% on that money you borrowed, but the amount of money you borrowed that's still outstanding is so little that maybe it's not as conducive to continuing to rent it out as the home where, it's worth $1 million today, but you still have $800,000 of debt on it at a 3% rate. So that is challenging you to think about when you have very favorable debt terms, thinking about, well, will this be to the client's benefit or not? Can we actually view that debt as an asset? Where the other side of the equation, right, is they have a lot of debt. It's a very high interest rate. Well, then it's not going to be as conducive there. You can't really think of it as an asset as much. It's more so, again, going to the concept of opportunity cost. If you're borrowing money at only 3% and you have a lot of money borrowed at 3%, well, can I make more than 3% with that money? And it's a lot easier to do that in today's market than it is to have a 6 or 7% fixed rate mortgage and have a low risk option to make more than 6 or 7% on an investment. That's much harder to do, even with great financial planners. And then the last piece I always bring up is, it's helpful to have hyper local market knowledge of the home. Your sellers, your owners, your clients will know this. If they're about to put in something that they think would be very unfavorable to their home value in the next few years, well, then maybe it is worth selling today versus holding on to it where that could erode the value of the home, where maybe it'd work as a good rental, but when they turn around and try to sell it years down the road, it's not worth as much. So just like any client, it's worth thinking through and looking ahead for developments in the area or what's going on within this very local community to think through. Maybe it does make sense to sell today. Cost to consider on the cost side. So this is putting more of a finance hat on for our clients. And if you guys ever need help with this, I'll make a plug for ourselves a few times, but I am a CPA. That's why I run our, I'm not just a real estate broker, but run our property management practice here at Blue Pebble. So this is stuff I'm fairly well versed in. If you ever need someone to actually break down the cost, put it into a financial model for your clients, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help there. I'm sure there can always be more cost to consider, but when you're renting a home and you're going to hold it, some of the biggest costs we still look at. So PITI. So this is your mortgage, but not just your interest related to the mortgage and your principal and interest payment if it's amortized over 30 years, but you'll still continue to pay property taxes on your home. We are not in a state where we typically pass that on to the tenants to cover your property taxes. Same with home insurance. Your insurance policy will often switch if this was a primary to now a rental property. You're going to get what's called a dwelling policy, which is oftentimes actually a little more affordable than your primary homeowner's hazard insurance, because a dwelling policy is often going to cover the structure and exterior and fixtures, but not your internal belongings. It's not your stuff in the home anymore, which is also why we always encourage, if your client gets renters, that they get rental insurance to cover their personal belongings. But that's why the new insurance policy will likely be a little bit cheaper than what they currently have in place. So think about those costs that they'll consider to pay relative to the rent. Then if it's in an HOA community, again, the HOA dues that they'd have to continue to pay. Oftentimes we don't pass that on to the renters as well. You want to think about a maintenance reserve. You want to think about ongoing repairs. I will say repairs are often overlooked. We have some very brand new, nice homes in the Highlands we manage. And I think it is extremely rare for a home to make it through a full year, a full lease of 12 months without having some form of repair occurring at the home. Now, sometimes this might just be a few $100 over the course of the year, but we definitely want to budget this out. If you need help thinking through, how do I evaluate cost to repair and what's appropriate reserves, can always feel free to reach out there. And then lastly, we'll talk more about hiring a management company, but if this is something they want to hold on to, but not actively manage themselves, 8 to 10% is the going rate to hire a property manager. And so make sure they're 8 to 10% of monthly rent collected, I should clarify. So make sure that's budgeted in as well. To now think through from a cash flow perspective, does this even make sense with all the additional holding costs? Am I in the black here? Any question on some of the costs we typically consider here? So oftentimes this is something like we're doing here, where you can see they're looking at renting a home. We're looking at rents. We're pricing in, some vacancy to say it's not going to be rented for 100% of the year. And a lot of those costs we're talking about, every year we're still paying our property taxes, our insurance, some utilities the owner will cover, especially in Denver, where you're paying your semi-annual wastewater treatment, quarterly trash, what have you, sometimes water, if it's shared units, budgeting in repairs and maintenance. You can see with, here we're thinking about almost $58,000 a year in rent, but once you deduct vacancy and all those costs, you're down to only $46,000. And that's even before thinking about, we always want to budget away a little bit every year for a reserve for any very big fixes. The roof, the furnace that will eventually need to be fixed, as well as debt. You end up, after all that, you have over $58,000 in rent to only $9,000 a year or so in what we thought the net cash flow would be we'd make off this property. Building something like this, again, can get fairly technical. You don't always need to get to that degree for your clients. We don't want you guys to be something that you are not, but at least being familiar with starting to talk them through these costs, and then be able to point them to another trusted advisor to help if they really want to get into the weeds of figuring out a calculation like this. Any other questions on cost, other common costs you guys know about or want to discuss when someone's holding onto a rental?
One to keep in mind too is when people move out, they don't always take all of their belongings with them
Yes.
when they leave. So always keeping a reserve for places like junk guys or stuff like that to help you dispose of property.
Yes. And so, once you're going from tenant to tenant, hopefully you have security deposits and funds set aside to cover that. But even when you as the owner are moving out and putting in your first tenant, we often see this where they have left behind a bunch of personal belongings. And they just ask us as the property manager, say, hey, we want to rent this place. We even have a lease signed. I don't know what to do with this. So obviously there's cost to get the home ready and get it deep cleaned. But there's also costs, like I think the last one we did, we paid over $500 in just junk removal, moving like good furniture out of there. And so you want to think about that as well to get the place up and ready to rent. That's a good call. Yeah, we're talking about, I keep returning to debt again, just as a litmus test. If it's someone who bought, early 2022 or before, they probably have more favorable debt terms that might make it more conducive to turn a primary into a rental home for them. Very important to understand though, not just rate, but is this a 30-year fix, 15-year fix? Is this an ARM? Because I have a lot of clients with a 5, 7, or 10-year ARM where even though they have a very low interest rate, they realize, well, I only have this rate for another year or maybe 2 years. Do I want to rent knowing that all of a sudden I'm going to be exposed to a floating rate at where market is today? So very likely we're going up to like 7% or so per year. And that might steer them to, since I didn't get a 30-year fixed, even though my rate is still low, maybe I want to sell sooner rather than later. Yeah, market indicators. I talked a bit there about, I do always like clients to understand we will not get a tenant in there day one. And if they're self-managing, very likely they don't get a tenant in there the day they move out. So understanding budgeting for vacancy. It could often be a few weeks to get that first tenant in there, even if you have the listing ready to go the day they move out. You also want to think of good rent indicators. How are they going to price a rental? Just like sales, like we want our clients to understand the comps, because very oftentimes they'll find, a friend of a friend in the area who has a place that's way nicer than theirs that rented for, a couple $100 more than we think they could ever get for that rental. So making sure we are being thorough, just like if they were reselling the home, thinking about what is a realistic rent that we can make on this home, and doing a budget and some vacancy, because you can't simply take that rent, multiply it by 12 and say, this is what you're going to get in the first year, but price for those few weeks of likely the home being vacant before you get tenants in place. Do you guys know where to look for good rental comps? Do you have a client saying, what do you think I can rent my home? Where would you tell them to look, or how would you aid them with determining the rent for their house?
Rent.com or Zillow, right?
Yeah, that's helpful to look at active listings. Now, it's worth knowing they're active because they're not rented yet. So sometimes those can go a bit high if you look at everything that's still available. It's kind of like looking at all the homes that are on the market right now for resale that have been there for a month, 2 months, so on and so forth. It's usually a pretty safe bet to say if that home does sell in the next few months, very likely won't sell for its list price.
It's Andre saying rentometer.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's what we use. Rentometer is a great source. Rentometer.com. There's a free version for like limited samples if you want to look up rents. We have a professional subscription if you guys ever need us to help you pull rent comps, where it will give us, the home attributes, give us a lot more confidence in homes that have actually been rented. So we like to use that. We still definitely talk to our owners, especially in like townhomes or condos where there's very like units right next to them, to understand their understanding of other homes in the area and what they've rented for recently. Take it with a grain of salt and still weigh that against Rentometer, because Rentometer is far from perfect. Usually using a hybrid of those two approaches, we can get a more realistic rent price. It's worth noting too, especially because it's December right now, our rental market is seasonal, just like our resale market, where it's important to look at when places were rented. Because even if you see all these homes that were renting for $3,000 a month that rented out this summer and spring, it'd be very hard for us to get $3,000 a month if you want it rented this month or before January 1st. There is very low demand right now for tenants looking to move or looking to rent around the holidays. All right. So yeah, we talked about rent estimator tools, rental comps, and then talking about, what is going to happen if you want to rent this home. This is kind of the lifestyle questions, less financial, although it could always come back to, time is money. But do your clients know what they're getting themselves into? Or would they need to hire a property manager? I think a lot of clients are quick to rush to, I can self-manage this myself. The home's in great shape. There's going to be very few issues. But it's worth noting, and I think we talk about this maybe on our next slide, that, well, at some point it's here. The business of property management is really risk mitigation, which means that, yes, there's likely few instances where you need a lot of help, but suddenly when that switch flips and you do need help, it can be high stakes and urgent. And that is the business of risk mitigation, and sometimes why it's helpful to have someone. So sure, anyone could go online and Google search, give me a lease agreement, or just you could go on Zillow yourself and list a home as well and take your own pictures with your own iPhone if you'd like to, just like our for sale by owner clients. But it's going to get potentially into hot water if and when things come up there. If your lease isn't, up to date with it. We live in a very renter tenant friendly state in Denver, especially municipality, where you want to be well versed on what you need to afford your tenant, because you could put whatever you want in that lease agreement, but you could later get sued if that lease is not actually up to date and you're requiring something of your tenant that the state of Colorado or the city of Denver disallows. And so again, it's infrequent this can happen, but it is helpful to have a professional with that in the leasing process. Likewise, making sure you're doing appropriate tenant screening, getting a good tenant in there. And then when it gets to maintenance, when someone's in there and payment collection and setting aside money and escrow funds, our clients can do this. Again, I manage my own rentals prior to coming over to Blue Pebble and heading up our property management business. But again, I'm a CPA. I was more well versed in some of this risk assessment and how to appropriately manage this. And so it's worth talking to your clients for, do they have the time and risk tolerance to take this on themselves, or is it worth it for them to hire out? Any questions on, helping clients think through, do they want to self-manage or not?
One of the things too, that I have a friend of mine who does maintenance for property management up in Greeley. And I don't think, and he works for like apartment complexes and stuff. And I don't think tenants, we are people who rent, realize you're taking on their lives as well. So if something happens, they have a medical emergency, somebody passes away in the home, all of that stuff, you're responsible for being able to get into the house. You have a property manager, they can handle that for you. That way you're not traumatized by somebody else's life experiences, because they're living in your house as it was their home, and things happen and come up that you're not prepared for or even think about or imagine.
Yeah, 100%. Typically when tenants have a problem, they have a problem that needs to be resolved ASAP. And so it's not always the luxury of, hey, this came up, can we deal with this over the next few weeks? But we need to fix this in the next 24 hours. Have someone on site or hired out to fix this. I will say, even though we have property management at Blue Pebble, there's two of us, Andre and myself, who run this business. We still have a backstop of, we pay a service provider 24/7 availability, where they have the ability, it's like a call center, but they also have dispatching ability to ensure that our tenants can always reach out and get someone on the phone ASAP in the event of emergency, and someone who has the authority to, if their place is flooding, bring someone in there right away, or make sure they have boots on the ground right away. So I know for a lot of our clients who are looking at maybe self-managing a home, do they have something like that in place? Are they still going to be living in the area and with that time and ability to drop things at a moment's notice to go help out? And so again, I know a lot of people who typically start self-managing and then within a year or so decide, wait, this was far too stressful. It is worth the peace of mind, and also, the risk mitigation or CYA, to make sure I don't get sued, to bring in someone professional here to do the property management.
Hey, Travis, do
Yeah.
you have a good resource for finding that data for like days on market, those kind of things for rentals?
It's funny. I don't have a great one for days on market. And it's worth noting to everyone listening here, you can list rentals on the MLS. And there you could, and if you look at MLS rentals, there you could get a much better sense of days on market. But the vast, vast, vast majority of rentals are transacted off of the MLS. They're not required to be listed there publicly. You can still list homes publicly on Zillow. For instance, I'd say over 90%, and Andre can probably chime in if I'm misleading us, but I'd say over 90% of our applicants we get for our rentals come through Zillow. They have essentially a monopoly on the business, where apartments.com and homes.com and rent.com, we get a few, but it's coming through these other third-party platforms where it is much harder to get a clean look at, normal days on market and some of those other factors, which is also why we use third-party service providers like Rentometer to at least get the rental comps. But that doesn't always do as good of a job letting us know like what the days on market is. I don't have a reliable tool there.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else there I could address if I didn't directly bring up, or maybe I tangentially talked about during the presentation, but now's a good time to ask those questions before we break. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Appreciate the participation as always. If you need help, if you have clients who are looking for a property manager, I know most resale brokerages do not offer property management because it's such a different risk profile and operational profile. So always know that you can reach out to us at Blue Pebble Homes, reach out to me directly if you'd like to. My email is ttalaric@bluepebblehomes.com, which I believe you should see in the calendar invite. But if not, however you signed up for this. If you were small enough brokerage, if you reach out to Cass or Jared, I'm sure you could find me. I'm always happy to talk with your clients, even if you're not a Blue Pebble broker, through property management options. And we take good care of our clients. Why we start property management here is because there's such a low bar in Denver of such horrible property managers, where I was not comfortable referring my clients out to other property managers because they kept burning my clients, and my clients were so unhappy with the end results. So if you ever want to talk property management, please reach out and let me know. All right, guys. Well, thank you for joining. And yeah, hopefully if you guys have any other kind of these short-term training ideas for other topics you'd like to cover, let us know, because there's a lot more items that property management would be happy to talk about. Thank you, guys.